I was not always confident when I spoke English. In fact, there was a time when I used to hesitate, even before forming a single sentence. Words would get stuck in my mind, my thoughts were clear, but my tongue would refuse to cooperate. I used to think English was something only talented people could speak fluently, but slowly I realized something very powerful. Fluency is not a gift, it is a habit. I stopped waiting for perfection. I stopped waiting for confidence. I started with what I had. My broken sentences, my small vocabulary, and my willingness to improve. Fluency is built, not gifted. And this is the truth I had to learn the hard way when I kept comparing myself with people who could speak English effortlessly, while I was still struggling to form simple sentences. For a long time, I believed that they were naturally better than me, that something in their personality or background made them fluent, while I was simply not designed for it. But over time, I realized that fluency is not something people are born with. It is something they construct slowly through repetition, patience, and daily effort that most people never see. What looks like talent is often just consistency in disguise. Quiet practice repeated over months and years until words start flowing without fear. When I first started trying to improve my English, I would stop myself before even speaking. My mind would translate thoughts back and forth, and by the time I found the right sentence, the moment had already passed. I thought this was a weakness, but later I understood it was just the beginning stage of learning. Every fluent speaker once stood exactly where I was, confused, slow, and unsure. The difference was not intelligence, it was persistence. Some people continued practicing even when it felt uncomfortable, and that discomfort slowly turned into confidence. I began to change my approach. Instead of waiting for the perfect environment or the perfect teacher, I started using my everyday life as practice. I would speak to myself in English while doing small tasks, describe what I was seeing, or repeat sentences I heard from videos. At first, it felt unnatural, almost embarrassing, as if I was forcing myself into something I didn't belong in. But I kept going because I realized that fluency doesn't grow in silence. It grows in action, even imperfect action. I stopped chasing perfection and started chasing repetition. There were days when I felt like I was not improving at all. I would make the same mistakes again and again, forget simple words, or hesitate in the middle of sentences. But I learned that improvement is not always visible in the moment. Just like planting seeds, you don't see immediate results. Yet something is growing beneath the surface. Every time I practiced, I was building familiarity with the language, even if I couldn't measure it instantly. And that invisible progress kept me going when visible results were missing. I also started listening more intentionally. Instead of just hearing English, I began to observe it, the way sentences were structured, the rhythm of speech, the way native speakers connected words naturally. I would repeat phrases out loud, not worrying about accent or perfection, just focusing on flow. Slowly, my mouth began to adjust to patterns my mind was still learning. It felt like training a muscle that had never been used before, weak at first, but gradually becoming stronger with every attempt. What changed everything for me was understanding that consistency matters more than talent. Talent may give someone a head start, but consistency determines how far they go. I saw that even on my worst days, doing something small in English was better than waiting for a perfect day that might never come. 5 minutes of speaking, 10 minutes of listening, a few written sentences, these small actions started building a foundation I could rely on. Over time, I stopped fearing mistakes because I realized mistakes were not signs of failure, but signs of participation. Every wrong sentence meant I was trying, and every correction meant I was learning. I no longer avoided speaking situations. Instead, I leaned into them, even when my voice shook or my grammar broke down. Because fluency was not hiding from errors, it was growing through them. There is still so much to learn, so many words I have not mastered, so many moments where I pause and search for expressions that don't come instantly. But I have stopped measuring myself against perfection and started measuring myself against yesterday's effort, and I keep showing up again without waiting for a perfect version of myself. To arrive, mistakes are part of learning. And this is something I had to accept before I could truly grow. For a long time, I treated mistakes like failures, as if every wrong sentence I spoke in English was a reflection of my ability. I would immediately feel embarrassed, sometimes even discouraged enough to stop speaking altogether. I thought that fluent people never made mistakes, that they spoke perfectly from the beginning, and that I was somehow behind because my sentences were not smooth or grammatically correct. But over time, I began to see mistakes from a completely different perspective. I realized that mistakes are not the opposite of learning. They are actually the path to it, and without them, there is no real progress. When I first started practicing English daily, I would hesitate before speaking because I was afraid of being wrong. That fear was louder than my desire to improve. I would carefully construct sentences in my mind, overthinking every word, and still end up staying silent because I didn't trust myself enough to try. But silence never builds fluency. Silence only keeps you in the same place. Slowly, I understood that every time I avoided speaking, I was also avoiding growth. The moment I started speaking despite being unsure, I started learning in a way that no book or rule could teach me. I remember how uncomfortable it felt to make mistakes in front of others. Even simple conversations felt heavy because I was constantly monitoring myself, afraid that I would say something incorrect. But then something changed when I started observing how children learn language. They don't begin by being perfect. They speak freely. They make errors without hesitation, and they keep going without shame. Their focus is not on correctness, it is on communication. That realization shifted something inside me. I began to understand that perfection is not the starting point of learning, it is the result of it. As I continued practicing, I started making more mistakes intentionally, or at least without fear. I allowed myself to speak without translating every sentence in my mind. I let go of the pressure to be correct all the time. And surprisingly, this is when I started improving faster. Every mistake became a teacher. Every wrong word showed me what I needed to learn next. Instead of feeling defeated, I started feeling curious. Why was this wrong? How can I say it better? That curiosity slowly replaced fear. There were moments when I would repeat the same mistake again and again. And instead of getting frustrated, I began to see a pattern. Learning is not a straight line. It is a cycle of trying, failing, correcting, and trying again. Each repetition builds awareness. Even when improvement is not visible immediately, something is changing internally. My mind was becoming more familiar with sentence structures. My ears were becoming more sensitive to correct forms, and my confidence was slowly building without me noticing it fully. What I also realized is that people who appear fluent today were once in the same place, making the same kinds of mistakes. The only difference is that they didn't stop. They stayed in the process long enough for mistakes to turn into mastery. That understanding removed a lot of pressure from me. I stopped expecting instant perfection and started respecting the process itself. I learned to be patient with my own voice, even when it didn't sound the way I wanted it to sound. Now, when I make mistakes, I don't see them as something to hide. I see them as evidence that I am still learning, still growing, still moving forward, even if slowly. There is a strange kind of freedom in accepting imperfection. It allows me to speak without fear, to try without hesitation, and to continue without stopping every time something goes wrong. And in that freedom, learning feels lighter, more natural, almost like a conversation with myself that keeps evolving. Daily practice creates confidence. But this confidence does not appear suddenly or dramatically. It builds quietly in the background while you are doing something small every single day. When I first started practicing English regularly, I did not feel confident at all. In fact, I often felt the opposite. I would speak slowly, pause frequently, and sometimes doubt every word I was saying. But I continued anyway, even when it felt like I was not improving, because I realized confidence is not something you wait for. It is something you create through repetition, through exposure, and through showing up for yourself, even when you don't feel ready. At the beginning, my practice was very simple. I would talk to myself about random things, describe my surroundings, or repeat sentences I had heard from others. It felt strange at first, almost pointless, because there was no one correcting me, no one praising me, no immediate result to prove that it was working. But I kept going because I understood that practice is not always about visible progress in the moment. It is about building familiarity with something that once felt foreign. And slowly, the unfamiliar starts becoming familiar. And that familiarity begins to feel like comfort. There were days when I felt like I was repeating the same level again and again, as if I was stuck in one place. My sentences were still not perfect, my vocabulary still limited, my hesitation still present. But I didn't realize that beneath that surface, something was changing. My brain was getting used to thinking in English more naturally. I was no longer translating every thought word by word. The process was slow, but it was happening silently, like a seed growing underground before it ever breaks the surface. The more I practiced, the less I feared speaking. At first, even a simple conversation would make me nervous. I would carefully prepare sentences in my mind before saying anything. But daily practice slowly reduced that fear. Because when you do something repeatedly, it stops feeling like a challenge and starts feeling like a habit. And when something becomes a habit, it loses its power to intimidate you. English stopped feeling like a subject I had to study and started feeling like a tool I could use. One of the most powerful changes I noticed was how my hesitation started to decrease. I no longer paused as long as I used to before speaking. I still made mistakes, but I stopped stopping myself. And that shift was more important than perfection. Confidence was not about speaking without errors. It was about speaking despite them. Each day of practice added a small layer of courage, even if I didn't notice it immediately. That courage started showing up in conversations where I didn't expect it, in moments where I surprised myself by responding without overthinking. There were also moments of frustration when I felt like I should be better than I was at that stage. I compared myself to others who spoke more fluently, and I questioned my progress. But over time, I understood that comparison steals confidence, while consistency builds it. I had to bring my focus back to my own journey, my own improvement, My own small wins that didn't look impressive from the outside, but meant everything internally. Even a single sentence spoken without fear became a quiet victory that added to my confidence bank without me realizing its value at first. As days turned into weeks, something subtle changed in the way I carried myself. I started feeling more comfortable expressing my thoughts, even if my grammar wasn't perfect. I stopped waiting for ideal conditions to practice. I would speak whenever I got the chance, even in small moments of the day. That constant exposure to the language slowly removed the distance between me and it. English was no longer something outside of me. It started becoming part of how I think, how I respond, how I interact with ideas and people around me in everyday situations, where language flows naturally without pressure but in the background, where hesitation used started before occupying that space, while I kept showing up again and again, even on days when motivation felt low, and I still chose to continue the practice without knowing exactly where would lead. A fear reduces when action induces, when induce, when and this is something I only understood after repeatedly choosing to speak instead of staying silent. In the beginning, fear controlled almost everything. It controlled when I spoke, how I spoke, and even whether I spoke at all. I would overthink simple conversations, imagining mistakes before they even happened. And because of that imagination, I would often stop myself from trying. I thought fear was something I needed to remove first before I could start speaking confidently. But I later realized that fear does not disappear before action. It disappears through action. When I started practicing English daily, fear was still very present. It showed up in hesitation, in nervous pauses, in the constant need to translate every thought before speaking. Even when I knew what I wanted to say, I would hold back because I was afraid of sounding wrong. That fear felt real, heavy, and convincing. It made me believe that I was not ready yet. But waiting for readiness only made fear stronger. The longer I stayed silent, the more powerful my fear became. And I slowly realized that silence was feeding the very thing I was trying to escape. One day, I decided to speak even with fear present. I did not wait for confidence. I did not wait for perfect sentences. I simply started speaking, even if my voice shook or my grammar broke. And something interesting happened. Fear did not disappear immediately, but it became smaller the moment I took action. It was still there, but it no longer had full control over me. That was the first time I understood that fear loses power when it is challenged, not when it is avoided. As I continued practicing, I noticed a pattern. On days when I spoke more, I felt less afraid. On days when I avoided speaking, my fear returned stronger. It was almost like a cycle. Action weakened fear and avoidance strengthened it. This realization changed everything for me. Instead of trying to wait for fear to go away, I started moving with it. I allowed fear to sit beside me while I practiced. Instead of letting it stop me, slowly, I stopped seeing fear as an enemy and started seeing it as something that could exist without controlling my decisions. There were moments when fear still tried to stop me, especially in conversations where I felt judged or unsure. My mind would tell me to stay quiet. But now I had something stronger than fear, and that was experience. Every time I had spoken despite fear, I had survived it. Nothing bad had happened. I had made mistakes, yes, but I was still learning, still improving, still moving forward. That experience started building evidence in my mind that fear is not as dangerous as it feels. With time, speaking English became more natural. Not because fear completely disappeared, but because it no longer had the same authority over me. I stopped negotiating with fear. I stopped asking myself whether I should speak or not. I simply spoke, and in that simple decision, I found freedom. The freedom to express myself without waiting for permission from my own thoughts. I also began noticing that fear often exists more in anticipation than in reality. Before speaking, fear feels huge, like a wall that cannot be crossed. But the moment you step into the situation, that wall becomes smaller, sometimes even irrelevant. Most of what I feared never actually happened. And what did happen was never as bad as I imagined. This gap between imagination and reality slowly weakened the emotional grip fear had on me. Daily practice played a major role in this transformation, because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity reduces fear. The more I practiced speaking, the more normal it felt. What once felt intimidating started feeling routine, and what once felt impossible started feeling manageable. Fear cannot survive long in an environment of consistent action. It fades quietly when it is not given attention, when it is not allowed to decide your direction, when it is repeatedly challenged by simple, steady effort that continues even when uncertainty is still present and hesitation still whispers in the background, but no longer has the final say in what I choose to do next.